Yorktown, How the Confederates Outsmarted McClellan, Magruder's Trickery. It's April 1862. Spring has sprung, the air is crisp, and General George B. McClellan is about to launch what he believes will be his crowning achievement, an intricate, large-scale campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. This wasn't a man content with minor skirmishes. McClellan was a visionary, or so he fancied himself. Unfortunately for him, reality doesn't always bow to grandeur. First, let's talk about the man with the plan, George Brinton McClellan, born into a wealthy family in Philadelphia in 1826. His father was a prominent surgeon, which naturally gave George a high societal standing and the finest education. He entered West Point at the tender age of 15 and graduated second in his class, proving that when it came to book smarts, he was no slouch. After fighting in the Mexican-American War and briefly leaving the military to dabble in engineering and politics, McClellan returned to military life, taking command of the Union Army of the Potomac. However, McClellan was more than just a general, he was an enigma. His men adored him, calling him Little Mac, but his fellow commanders found him to be an egomaniac with a Napoleon complex. McClellan once described Abraham Lincoln as an idiot and a well-meaning baboon, hardly the kind of talk you'd expect from someone who was supposed to answer to the man. But that's the thing about McClellan, for all his military genius, he had one fatal flaw: he was paralyzed by his own fear of failure. And oh, did that fear show itself when he embarked on the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan's plan was bold. Rather than attack Confederate forces head-on, he would outsmart them. Sailing his massive army down the Chesapeake Bay, he'd land on the Virginia Peninsula and march west to Richmond, bypassing Confederate defenses in northern Virginia. A perfect plan, right? Well, that's where it all started to unravel. McClellan's army, 121,500 strong, embarked on this grand naval journey with optimism. They were to land at Fort Monroe at the southeastern tip of the peninsula. From there, it was supposed to be a smooth march toward Richmond. But even before they landed, things weren't going as smoothly as McClellan had envisioned. Commanders like General Edwin Sumner and General Samuel Heintzelman found themselves frustrated by the logistics of moving such a large army across water. The weather, unpredictable and tempestuous, added delays. But none of these hiccups seemed to bother McClellan, at least not yet. McClellan's officers were loyal but not immune to grumbling. General John Porter, one of McClellan's closest confidants, was known for his quiet sarcasm and witty remarks. "We shall walk straight into Richmond, George," Porter quipped to McClellan. "If only we can get out of this cursed swamp first." It was a bit of foreshadowing because the peninsula's marshy terrain would later prove to be a nightmare for McClellan's men and artillery. As McClellan's forces moved inland, they encountered an unexpected obstacle: Yorktown. This wasn't supposed to happen, at least not in McClellan's mind. Yorktown was defended by the colorful and theatrical Confederate General John Bankhead Magruder. And let me tell you, Magruder knew how to put on a show. Born into a wealthy Virginia family in 1810, Magruder was a flamboyant, charismatic figure. His military career had taken him through the Mexican-American War, and he had gained a reputation for having a flair for the dramatic. He wasn't the most brilliant strategist, but what he lacked in tactical genius, he made up for in sheer audacity. With just 11,000 men at his disposal, Magruder faced an army that outnumbered him 10-1. But instead of panicking, he decided to put his acting skills to use. You see, Magruder was a master of deception, and deception was exactly what he used to trick McClellan into thinking that Yorktown was brimming with Confederate forces. What did Magruder do? Well, he ordered his men to march in endless circles. From one position to another, they marched and countermarched, occasionally stopping to fire a few shots just for effect. To the Union scouts watching from afar, it seemed as though Magruder had an entire army moving in and out of fortifications. In reality, it was the same tired, underfed soldiers marching in circles, but it worked like a charm. McClellan's scouts reported back with inflated numbers, and McClellan did what McClellan does best: he hesitated. Instead of launching a swift assault that could have easily overwhelmed the undermanned Confederate defenses, McClellan decided that the safer course of action was to dig in for a siege. Yes, that's right, McClellan, with more than 120,000 men, chose to dig trenches and prepare for a prolonged siege against a force less than a tenth of his size. McClellan's top officers, men like General Heintzelman and General Keyes, were beside themselves. "This is madness," General Keyes exclaimed in a meeting with McClellan. "We have the numbers, we can take Yorktown by tomorrow." But McClellan was unmovable, convinced that Magruder was playing for time until massive Confederate reinforcements could arrive. General Heintzelman reportedly remarked, "We could storm these fortifications with a strong wind and a stick, but instead, we wait while Magruder sets up campfire skits." Let's start by rolling the clock back to April 1862. Picture this: McClellan, with a massive army of 121,500 men, is sitting outside the Confederate stronghold at Yorktown, preparing for what he believes is the mother of all sieges. He's got siege guns, trenches, and an irrational fear that the Confederates have a bazillion soldiers waiting to pounce on him. Spoiler alert, they didn't. They barely had 11,000 men. But hey, when you're McClellan, enemy numbers are always exaggerated, like a fisherman's tale of the one that got away. Meanwhile, in Richmond, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was the man President Jefferson Davis had put in charge of defending the city from McClellan's advancing army. Now, Johnston wasn't a fan of flashy, dramatic tactics. He had a simple military motto: stay alive, stay defensive, and don't do anything stupid. He believed in cautious, pragmatic warfare. Born in 1807 in Virginia, Johnston had a long military career, having fought in the Mexican-American War and several skirmishes in the South. While his family life was relatively private, his public life was anything but. Johnston was a capable soldier but didn't exactly have a reputation for getting along with the higher-ups. He clashed with Davis like oil and water. Why, you ask? Well, Johnston wasn't fond of being micromanaged, and Davis, let's just say, had an opinion on just about everything. The two men would argue over just how aggressive their strategies should be, with Davis wanting more boldness and Johnston playing the long game of survival. When Johnston got wind of McClellan's massive army parked outside Yorktown, he knew Magruder's meager defenses wouldn't hold for long. So, he ordered reinforcements to bolster the lines. It wasn't exactly a cavalry charge, but it would do. The Confederate soldiers arrived under Johnston's command, ready to turn Yorktown into a muddy, frustrating standoff. Johnston himself, though, wasn't thrilled by the idea of facing off against such overwhelming odds. He reportedly arrived at Yorktown, took one look at McClellan's massive army and siege works. Johnston, a gruff, no-nonsense commander, was baffled when he saw McClellan's inactivity. "Why on earth hasn't he attacked?" he asked Magruder, who could only shrug and smile. On the Union side, McClellan, sitting comfortably behind his massive fortifications, was busy doing what he did best: digging trenches, preparing siege guns, and writing endless letters to Washington complaining that he was outnumbered. His obsession with enemy numbers was legendary. McClellan believed Johnston's forces had been reinforced with tens of thousands of troops, and that kept him from making any bold moves. Meanwhile, Johnston had barely enough men to fill a football stadium. President Lincoln, who had grown increasingly tired of McClellan stalling, once quipped, "If General McClellan is not using the army, I should like to borrow it for a while." Their relationship wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy, to say the least. Lincoln had appointed McClellan with high hopes, but the general's constant delays were testing his patience. The letters between the two reflected this growing tension, with Lincoln subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, urging McClellan to stop obsessing over Confederate numbers and actually fight. McClellan, however, remained convinced that the Confederates were ready to pounce at any moment. To add to the drama, he even sent up observation balloons to spy on enemy positions. These weren't just any balloons, they were manned by Union generals, floating high above the battlefield like some Civil War-era surveillance drones. One such balloon, piloted by General John Porter, nearly met with disaster when strong winds almost sent it crashing into Confederate lines. It turns out air travel in the 1860s wasn't the safest career choice. By mid-April, with tensions running high and both sides growing restless, McClellan decided to test the Confederate defenses at Lee's Mill. This was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission, just a quick look at enemy strength. But in true McClellan fashion, it quickly spiraled into a skirmish. Union troops launched an assault, and for a moment, it looked like something might actually happen. Confederate forces, however, held their ground, and the reconnaissance turned into little more than a muddy standoff. Nothing much changed, except that the soldiers got a little wetter and a lot more frustrated. While McClellan was dithering on the Union side, things weren't all roses for the Confederates either. Johnston and Davis, ever the frenemies, were butting heads over strategy. Johnston favored a defensive war, pulling back and preserving his forces, while Davis wanted more aggressive actions to defend Richmond. Their relationship was like a dysfunctional marriage held together by a shared enemy, the Union Army. The Confederate High Command was dealing with its own political infighting, with Davis often pushing for more boldness, while Johnston continued to dig in, literally and figuratively. Johnston's relationship with Robert E. Lee was much more collegial, though. Both men respected each other, with Lee often playing the mediator between Johnston and Davis. But the political tensions within the Confederate command would only worsen as the war dragged on. Finally, after nearly a month of trench digging, McClellan was ready to launch an all-out bombardment to break the Confederate lines at Yorktown. But just as he was about to unleash his siege guns, Johnston pulled a fast one. On the night of May 3rd, under the cover of darkness, the Confederates quietly slipped away from Yorktown, retreating toward Richmond. It was a classic Johnston move, pragmatic, cautious, and, most importantly, it saved his army for another day. When McClellan's forces woke up on May 4th, they found the Confederate lines completely abandoned. Johnston, ever the master of understatement, reportedly smirked and said, "Well, they'll have to chase us now." The Confederate retreat was a well-executed operation. Johnston moved his men with precision, leaving behind just enough decoys to confuse the Union army. By the time McClellan realized what had happened, the Confederates were already miles away, slipping through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. The Siege of Yorktown, while technically a Union victory, was a missed opportunity. McClellan's obsession with enemy numbers and his reluctance to take risks allowed Johnston's forces to escape. What could have been a decisive blow to the Confederacy turned into a frustrating stalemate. McClellan would go on to express regret for his cautious approach, though he never fully accepted responsibility for the missed opportunity. Johnston, on the other hand, continued his defensive tactics, eventually clashing with Davis over his reluctance to engage in bold offensives. In the end, the Siege of Yorktown was a lesson in the price of caution. McClellan's hesitancy cost him the chance for a decisive victory, while Johnston's cautiousness allowed his army to live to fight another day. Both men were haunted by their choices, and the war would continue to grind on for years, with thousands more lives lost in the process.